Hello, everyone. Welcome to our forum, November's forum. This is Betty Arguello, and welcome to our Global Business Forum for November. And I have a couple of announcements before we proceed with the forum. The first one is the conference, NAR conference, is going to be in November 10 to the 13 in Orlando, Florida. If you are planning to go, please let Steve know that you're going. I'm going, by the way. And then the second one, if you have traveled in the last 3 months for business or attended a conference or participated in a cultural fair or chamber function, put in the chat, please. That will be very, very helpful. And without further ado, we're going to introduce our speaker, Sharon von Schoenberg. She is BCOM, CIPS, CIE Manager, Global Strategy Relations, and at the Canadian Real Estate Association. And about her, Sharon von Schoenberg oversees the successful execution of CREA's international strategy to increase global opportunities for realtors and global relations for the association. Her initiatives include the Global Affiliate Program, building relationships with international associations and trade-related organizations, developing educational opportunities for members, and increasing the relevancy of Realtor.ca for global visitors. Prior to joining CREA, Sharon was a Canadian residential appraiser and held marketing and client management positions in the private and nonprofit sector. In addition to her extensive program management and marketing experience, Sharon understands and believes in the importance of building relationships to be successful. Sharon holds a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Ottawa, is a certified association executive, and a CIPS specialist designee. Welcome, Sharon.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Betty, for that introduction and reading that bio. I didn't realize that would be done, but I'm super excited to be here today. And I also have with me in recording, but here in heart and spirit, is Brian Finley, who is a practitioner, broker owner of buyer agent Brian in Edmonton, Alberta, and he'll be sharing some highlights on the market. To start us off, though, I'm going to share my screen. This always takes a moment, so please bear with me. You should see a blue screen first, and then I hope you will see my first slide. Perfect. So can everybody, if I can just get a verbal, you can see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, great. Awesome. So here we are to share some insights on real estate business in Canada. As mentioned, I'm Sharon von Schoenberg. I'm super excited to be here, Manager Global Strategy and Relations with the Canadian Real Estate Association, and Brian Finley, who will be here with us through recording. And as I mentioned, he's broker owner, a buyer agent Brian in Edmonton, Alberta. So the Canadian Real Estate Association, I just thought I would start with who we are for those who may not be familiar. We are like NAR, but in Canada. So we represent, we're the single largest industry association. We represent about 155,000 realtors across Canada, working through 74 real estate boards and associations across the country as well. So very similar to NAR, a realtor would belong at the local level, then the provincial level, and with us nationally. Part of our work here at CREA, again, very similar to NAR, we advocate to the federal government on legislation that will affect members and impact home ownership in Canada. We work to enhance our members' professionalism and ethics through national standards, including the establishment of symbols and quality associated with using CREA brands and trademarks. We produce up-to-date information analysis on the housing sector and economic issues, and we own and operate Realtor.ca on behalf of our members, and I'll share a little bit more on that in a moment. But Canada, let's talk about Canada. We always say use that divide by 10 factor when we think of the US and Canada. Here in Canada, we have about 38.5 million is our population. When we look at some of the key things around Canada, with Invest Canada is a government site that promotes why companies should come and move their operations or bring operations to Canada. We're ranked #1 best quality of life, best for human freedom. And Canada has 6 cities among the world's top 100 best cities. Some of these you've probably heard of. Toronto ranks in those top 100. Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, which is Alberta, just above Texas, Ottawa, and Edmonton. So you've got 2 great cities you can consider in the province of Alberta, and Brian will share a little more on those markets shortly. We're 3rd in the G7 for federal direct investment flows in 2020. We're 1st in G7 for political stability, 9th largest economy, and the largest Fortune 500 companies are expanding existing operations or establishing new research and development here in Canada, and in part because of our sound and safe banking system. Canada gives preferential market access through 14 trade agreements to 49 countries with nearly 1.5 billion consumers and a combined GDP of 60 trillion US dollars. For those that are familiar with Canada, we have 13 international airports, 43 total airports of entry, 17 seaports, and 117 border crossings to the US. So no surprise, the US is a great trading partner and also real estate investor here in Canada. Canada has a highly educated workforce in the world. 62% of Canadians aged 25 to 64 graduated from a tertiary education institution. And we are the #1 country for entrepreneurs, attractiveness among G7 nations, and have a large tech brain gain. A lot of talk around technology in the last few years, really around the world. And our tech brain gain in 2021 saw Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver placing in the top 5 places in the world for gain. And yesterday, some of you may be familiar with Shein. It's an online fashion retailer, and they just opened a global headquarters in Toronto. They made that announcement yesterday. So lots of interesting companies that are coming to Canada. You see here some great images of our country from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast. There you see the lighthouse that's in PEI and in between. So I thought I'd share a couple of figures around inbound international traffic with Canada. And I thought I'd start with Realtor.ca. So I had mentioned that CREA owns and operates Realtor.ca. It's Canada's #1 website for properties in Canada. It's a portal that showcases properties all across our country. Realtor.ca attracts international eyes and consumers. And according to our 2021 Realtor.ca Insights report, we had an increase in international visitors of 21%, with a total of 14.9 million visits in 2021. That's about 5% of our traffic to the site, and roughly 3% of direct leads to our realtors come from Realtor.ca. So you can hop on Realtor.ca anytime and see what's for sale and lease. Since COVID hit, we've been averaging around 250,000 listings on that site. Pre-COVID, we were closer to the 350,000. So just like many similar countries and markets around the world, supply continues to be a little bit of an issue for Canada. But I'm going to move now to a couple of results of our international survey. Many of you are probably familiar with the National Association of Realtors International Activity in U.S. report, and we worked with NAR back in 2018 to bring that survey to Canada. So we launched, it's a very similar survey here in Canada, looking at international activity in the Canadian real estate market. So we've started doing this survey in 2018, and I believe NAR has been doing their survey since 2009, and many markets around the US do an individual survey as well. So it's really interesting to be able to compare our results, what our members are reporting. So what I'm going to share with you now are just a couple of slides from our 2021. So we survey based on January 1st to December 31st of the year. So these results are from January 1 to December 31, 2021, sorry. In that year, we had roughly 9,000 of our members complete the survey. So here you'll see major destinations of international buyers. So we find that of our international buyers, majority are buying in Ontario, BC, Alberta. You can see there, Quebec and Nova Scotia experienced quite an increase really from 2020 to 2021. And that's a lot of post-COVID buying, people selling up in Toronto and moving into Nova Scotia. According to our members, the top international buyers are from US, China, Hong Kong, India, UK, then France. But what's really interesting is what are they buying? And to no surprise, I think it's very similar to what we see in the NAR results, that a detached single family home is by far on demand, if you will, of our international buyers. Our members report that 61% of their international buyers tend to be resident buyers. So again, we use a very similar definition. A resident buyer being here on a work visa, could be student, but they're here in the country, versus a non-resident buyer that may be buying for a holiday home and or investment rental. So of the buyers, of all of our international buyers, detached single family is top of mind, followed by condo, and then a freehold, which is like a townhouse that does not have any HOA or common fees. This next slide just briefly shows what are those intended use of those properties by our international buyers. So again, I mentioned it's 60 point something percent, usually 61% are saying primary. And then you see the breakdown that others are looking to vacation and rental, vacation home, and or strictly rental. So just I thought I'd just share those very quickly to give you a flavor of what's happening on the international side. I'm going to move into Brian's part of the presentation. He's going to share some market updates, what's happening in housing here in Canada, and a little more insight. So let's start with Brian. Here we go.
Brian Finley here from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I want to talk a little bit today about kind of give you a Canadian market update, and at the same time, maybe look at some of the differences that occur in the transaction. So we're going to kind of take it from the big macro right down to the micro level, so that you can kind of get a better flavor for the Canadian market and understand maybe some of the nuances and some of the differences in the process as we go through it. So let me pull up very quickly the slide deck. And I'm going to really start by talking about the Canadian market in that big macro picture that we all kind of look at to see, or try and figure out as much as we can, where this market might be going. I always stress, I do teach the CIPS course, so I always stress when teaching that when we look at any international, we always look for the differences. And certainly in a cross-border situation like we're talking here with the United States and Canada, looking for the differences is very important, because they tend to be they're small differences. I mean, we are speaking the same language. We are, many of us, members of the National Association of Realtors. But the bottom line is, for those individuals who are buying or selling property, it's the little differences between what occurs in the Canadian marketplace and what occurs in the US marketplace that, as an agent, for me to do a good job for my clients, I really need to understand. So we're going to take a look at the whys of our market. We'll give you the numbers as well, and kind of the ways of the marketplace. And I should be able to cover both of those here in the next few minutes, while I kind of give you an update at the same time about what's going on in the world in Canada. So I'm going to be using some September numbers here real quick. I'm not going to throw a lot of numbers at you, but I did want you to at least start to see this so you've got a flavor. Again, don't forget, real estate is local. So I'm going to give you like this big average number, 640,000. I'm also going to suggest to you that one of the things that we tend to find is that when we have individuals coming into the Canadian marketplace, they are paying more than whatever the average is, regardless of pretty much which marketplace they are entering. So that number is really the Canadian landscape. If you were looking at an international, somebody coming in, generally speaking, they're going to be paying a higher number than that would be. So just keep in mind, it's all local. That's the one thing that is unchanged as we look at the marketplace that has changed dramatically over the last year. Right now, we have lower sales activity. We have many sellers opting basically to play a waiting game, to sit on the side of the market. I would say we're in what we call a tight side of a balanced market, but we are pretty much in a balanced market anywhere you look across Canada. We don't have a lot of historic precedent for what's currently going on with our current marketplace. There's been too many changes over the last year for us to really get a handle on where the market thinks it's going. I think most of us would agree that the pre-pandemic idea was that things were going to slow down, that prices might actually lower, that the demand might lower. And in fact, that's not what we saw over the last year. So we saw the same things up here that I think most of you down in the United States saw, which is just that the market actually was, close to on fire a year ago. And the numbers were huge, despite the fact that we were dealing with a pandemic, or maybe because of the fact that we were dealing with a pandemic. So we don't have a lot of historic precedents for this. We did not see the same kind of things that they saw in the United States in 2007, 2010 time period. We have a different control in terms of our mortgage market. It's much more federally related. And so there are limitations on what individuals can do related to the financing. And as a result of that, we actually were a little insulated in that 2006, 2000 timeframe. And so our prices basically flattened for a little bit of period, but then they started to go back up again. And they haven't stopped since then. So basically what you're seeing now is we are starting to see an adjustment for higher borrowing costs. We're dealing with this worldwide inflation out there. As a result of this worldwide inflation, we have a situation that basically is causing the interest rates to go up, something that in the last 20 years, since I've been here, I came to Canada in 2000. Since I've been here, the consumer in Canada has not had to deal with that. They are now having to deal with all of the press that's going on about increased rates. And we've seen that basically the fixed rate is now back in vogue. Most people took the variable rates up until the last year. They took the variable rates because it allowed them to qualify for more property. That's no longer true. The change in the rates are such that now basically fixed rate is back in vogue, especially with all of the talk about, increased inflation and increased interest rates. So as such, what we have right now is kind of a softness on the sales side. The resale markets, they remain on what I would call kind of the quiet side. And the other piece that you just always have to look at is the rental market, because the rental market is under a lot of pressure as a result of that. As I said before, we're always looking for the differences. And when we talk about location, the Canadian landscape has some significant differences. And you can see that right on this slide here, because what you can see is you can see Vancouver and you can see Toronto and you can see a number that's got 7 digits in it, which means we've got a market where the average home price is over $1 million. You have to compare that then to places like Calgary, which is here in Alberta. I'm in Edmonton. Our number is actually even lower than that. And the bottom line is that means there's a huge discrepancy between, obviously, the Vancouver-Toronto marketplace and the Calgary, the Montreal, the Halifaxes of the world. So we have that difference in terms of our marketplaces. And one of the things that you'll find is that what we don't have is we don't have a lot of movement of individuals like leaving the Vancouver or the Toronto area and coming to Calgary or Montreal or Halifax. In fact, what has occurred over the last year and a half is, as an example, in the Toronto marketplace, what's happened is it's pushed out, but within the range of Toronto. So, so places like Ottawa, which is not that far away, and other cities around that greater Toronto area have all seen individuals moving further into those areas. And as a result, they've been impacted from a dollars and cents standpoint as well. If you want to think about what this means related to 2023, right now, what's expected is that with the interest rates going up, with the changes that we've seen in that marketplace, national home sales pretty much are going to say either level or just a little bit lower. So they may go down a little bit. We got those sellers kind of sitting on the side to some extent. We've got people who now are pushed out of the market because they were right on the borderline to begin with, the first-time home buyers. The national average home price, however, is really expected to stay pretty much the same. It is not expected to decrease significantly at this point in time. So we are not looking for a huge adjustment, at least based on what we currently are dealing with. So why are homes so expensive in Canada? So I told you I want to talk a little bit about the differences. And both Canada and the United States, I know we're dealing with what I would call frothy valuations. However, the reasons, the economics in the Canadian landscape aren't necessarily the same as those in the United States. And as a result, it kind of helps if you understand why houses are so expensive in Canada. Why are we dealing with $1 million averages in our Toronto and our Vancouver? And there's 3 or 4 that I want to touch on just so that you understand them. The first one is that we have much stricter government regulations here in Canada related to the building of a home. As a result of that, in an area like Toronto, or even for that matter, like my own Edmonton, to build a home is not an easy process. There are a lot of regulations. It takes a long time to get the product to the market. The easiest way to say it is it's burdensome on the builders. And as a result of that, especially since most homes are built in an urban environment in these city centers or the suburbs, then there are going to be a lot of local, a lot of federal, a lot of provincial restrictions about the wheres and the hows and the whens a home can be built. So part of the issue in Canada related to housing is just the fact that fewer homes are being built than are needed to handle our population. And so as a result of that, there is obviously upward pressure. You know, we're back to the old supply and demand that we always look at. That's one piece of it. It takes longer to get a house built. It's harder for a builder to convince themselves to build houses in advance. And then we look at immigration in Canada. So now we talked a little bit about the supply side. Now we have to talk a little bit about the demand side. So I'm going to tell you within the last week, it was being discussed about the fact that from a Canadian standpoint, they are hoping that by 2025, we have 500,000 individuals coming in, immigrating into Canada. That means 500,000 more people who all need some form of housing. So that's the government's objective right now, is to bring in 500,000. Understand that when individuals immigrant, we have a pretty open door policy here. When they immigrant, they don't necessarily settle in, you know, just 1 or 2 locations. They can go anywhere, and depending on where they go, that may have an impact, obviously, on the housing supply in that particular location. And as a result of that, you're going to see an increase in cost in the various locations, depending on where the immigrants settle. Basically, right now, top countries for immigration would include India, China, the Philippines, Nigeria, Pakistan, and to a lesser extent, but right in there, is actually the United States as well. So we have a nice mix, which is great. But the bottom line is we already have a supply issue, and now what we're looking at is increasing our demand, not through a trend in our own population, but through the fact that we are looking at bringing in 500,000 more people annually into the country. So there you go, supply and demand. The other piece that you need to understand, which is definitely different than what you are probably experiencing in your own market is this whole idea of the higher rates of urban living. Yes, Canada is the second biggest country in area. However, as you can see from that map that's there, a good portion of Canada is the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And you can see that the numbers there would suggest, and I'm using the international students to kind of really hammer home the idea that the bottom line is you will find that our population quite often is right along the border between Canada and the United States. So when we talk about Vancouver and Toronto, it's not a surprise that you're looking at that 47% and that 22%. Those are where those properties are. The other provinces, you're going to see it's much less when we look at international students. But in addition to that, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that this is related to the whole population. The fact is, even though we have a lot of area, our population tends to be very much centered along the US-Canadian border. It means that you've got more buyers in a much smaller area. What do we get? We get demand at the end of the day. So, and as you know, somebody who's getting to deal with snow this week here in Edmonton. Bottom line is, I don't think we're thinking about necessarily moving up north to the Yukon or the Northwest Territories. If anything, we're just trying to figure out how we can get a little bit closer to where you are. So there's another piece that would just suggest that we are grouping to the point where we are creating some problems with our supply and demand. The other piece is foreign investment, which has been a big discussion up here. And so basically, we have been a very attractive place and a very open place in terms of investment coming from the international marketplace. We've got a very liberal policy, have had since I've been here, when it comes to outside investment. Now, that obviously can put a strain on your housing market when you have a lot of individuals coming in who have an investment mentality. Generally speaking, those investors are looking to either hold the property until such time as they see price increases, or in a lot of cases, we found that this becomes a place to safeguard their capital. That is, we can put it in a marketplace that's safe. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy for these investors, because the more investment, the more they hold, the more the prices rise, the more we're underutilized, the more we have that discrepancy between the whole idea of supply and demand. So that has had an impact on our market. Certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen how that plays out. Now you throw in a pandemic mindset, and what you've got is you've got historically low supply of houses on the market. And historically, Canada has been very slow to change regulation. And generally, people here don't migrate the same way you would think, well, we're just going to go to this town because it's cheaper. All they do is kind of push out from their own locations or where they are into some areas that are, you know, somewhat untapped. However, there's any number of locations and towns that kind of surround, for instance, the Toronto market. And the bottom line is they have no land left for building houses. So this is that supply and demand. However, as I said, while generally speaking, Canada has been slow to change, we're pretty much in a position where we need to do something, because we are pushing our own population out of the housing market with these high prices, and now with higher, obviously, interest rates. So things have changed slightly, or at least they are expected to change. So there is now June of 2022, there basically was the Foreign Restrictions and Taxes bill that has been passed, which will go into effect. It's going to be a 2-year ban starting in January 1st of 2023. I'll talk just a little bit about provincial policies in a minute, but bottom line is, what you need to understand is that we have never had, you know, on a national policy level, any kind of bans in terms of ownership. We did, back in 2016 and 2018, see some changes. We saw, for instance, British Columbia put in some of their own policies. So the province put in policies basically related to taxing individuals who were purchasing property. That's what they did in 2016. So if you're coming international, you were going to pay, if you were going in certain areas, more money. Bottom line is that worked a little bit and then it softened and didn't seem to be doing much. And so the next thing they did was they actually put in additional tax scenarios in those areas in BC again, where basically if the property was vacant, you were actually paying an additional tax in order to keep that property vacant. That had a little bit of a softening effect in the market. And then generally speaking, the market came back and rebounded again. So we've seen some changes in terms of taxation in various locations, provincial policies. Bottom line is that hasn't stopped our prices from going up in the last year. We have not seen that push it down. And so now the foreign tax is put in place to see whether this will also push it down. You have to remember again what I said earlier, which is, all real estate is local. And so part of the issue here is if we're looking at local real estate in my area where I can go out and get a single family home with 3 bedrooms in it for 400,000 or 425,000, then that might be something that an individual would look for. And the bottom line is it's going to have a negative impact on my market as well as what it's supposed to have, which is kind of a softening impact on the Torontos and the Vancouvers of the world. And unfortunately, you've put into place basically a rule across the board, which is going to have quite different impacts depending on where you are. So we'll have to see how that plays out. One of the things that's important for you to understand is that the Canadian Real Estate Association, CREA, which is our voice here from a government standpoint, is having a lot of conversations, trying to have more conversations with the whole idea, because we have not seen what this exactly looks like. And we're a month, 2 months away from actually having this go into play. But right now there's too many unknowns. And one of the things that we've looked at, for instance, is can't we put something in there that would turn around and would suggest that what we're going to do is basically exempt individuals from the United States and from Mexico who want to become property owners. But we're a long ways away from knowing exactly how this plays out, other than to know that as of January 1st, basically there will be these requirements. So that's a big macro picture that I wanted you to kind of understand. And now I'm just going to take a few minutes and kind of just talk through the transaction. So let's get kind of on the micro so that you kind of understand some of the nuances and the differences between the way you do real estate down there and we do real estate up here. A lot of it is the same, but it's those differences that's going to make you that much of an asset to your buyer, your referral, the individuals that are coming in to see you, just knowing what they know or what they think they know before they actually get there. So let's take a quick look at the US versus Canada differences as related to the transaction. And I'll take you right through the transaction the way that you would normally think of it, just in terms of the first piece is all about, real estate transactions in terms of representation. What's different from Canada and the US? Well, like different states have different rules and requirements, different provinces have different requirements. So this is a case where if you have somebody coming down and they're coming from Canada, don't assume that because they're coming into you from Alberta, that that's the same as a player who's coming into you for an Ontario. That's not the case. The way we handle representation up here is on a provincial basis. Most provinces do not require a written document related to working with the buyer. So as a result of that, it could be that you could be dealing with somebody who has not a lot of information in terms of having somebody represent them on the buy side. So we have that piece. When we look at process and timelines, generally to be honest with you, we can move a property in probably as little as 7 to 10 days if it needs to move in 7 to 10 days. So we can go from it's on the market to it's sold in a week if we need to. Generally, we only have 3 conditions, regardless of which province you're in. Usually those conditions are financing, inspection, and condominium documents, if that applies. So our contracts are basically across the country. We basically all go to CREA to get our forms. And as a result of that, while there are little nuanced differences between the provinces, generally speaking, you're talking about forms that are maybe 5 or 6 pages long. I can remember this was pre-pandemic when I was down in Arizona to purchase property, and my package to sign when I was down there was like 3/4 of an inch. So different locations in your area may have different requirements as well. I don't know how many pages your purchase and sale contract is, but I imagine you have a number of conditions on yours that your Canadian buyer is just not going to be familiar with. And of course, that just means that if you've got somebody coming from Texas up here, that what they're going to see is that's very much of a streamlined process. So it's not going to take them 2 months to get into a property unless they want it to be that way. So yeah, gives you just a quick idea. Understand that too, I should mention here in terms of representation and commissions and what have you, nobody in Canada, nobody at a consumer level is watching the current court cases that are going around in the United States related to this whole idea of buyer's commissions, seller's commissions, and the lawsuits that are going on down there. Our consumers are not listening to what's going on in the real estate world down there specifically. So just recognize that you're going to deal with representation based on what your state requires, but understand that the process takes a lot less time up here and may not be as formal up here. And that's kind of some of it, because the fact that we use lawyers, versus notaries. Anytime we talk international, anybody international, we always talk about notaries because a number of international markets use the notary. Actually, the only notaries that we use up here in Canada are in Quebec, the province of Quebec, which is very French, for lack of a better word. And as a result of that, they tend to use some of the more European. So there you would find it would be a little bit different. Again, back to, what province are they coming from? If they're coming from Quebec, then you might want to know how to speak French if you're going to work with them. So we use lawyers, and lawyers basically handle this. We use trust accounts to hold funds. We do not have escrow up here. Quebec has a process which is much more similar to what you would be familiar with in the United States as far as escrow is concerned. But the bottom line is up here, it's very simple in terms of you have a lawyer handling for the buyer, a lawyer handling for the seller. They usually have protocols, which mean they promise to do things to each other. As a result, a few days before key release, we actually have everything signed, done, and agreed to. And really the key release is just the day that we release the funds. And that, as I said, can happen very, very quickly. So trust accounts versus escrow. If we're looking at transaction costs, one of the things that you might want to recognize with transaction costs is looking, as always, about taxes, what's going on with the various taxes, especially since now we have places like BC, and we're seeing this across the country now as governments the local governments try to regulate or try to impact the supply and demand issues that we have. You can see that we've got situations where they are adding taxes on. So if somebody's coming up here, you need to talk to a realtor on the ground in that location who understands what the tax implications are. I'm not going to get into things like, the taxes that you have to worry about in terms of capital gains or what have you. We basically don't have capital gains on a primary residence up here. That's how that works. But if it's an individual coming from the United States, then some of those rules are slightly different. And so you would need to, again, in that case, talk to the individuals on the ground who have the information for you. So our transaction costs are not terribly different than some of yours are in terms of commission, in terms of those kinds of structures. So it's just good to look at that. Our legal fees are probably in the neighborhood of, $1,200 to $1,500 to move that transaction along, assuming that there's no issues with that. What you will need to look at is maybe GST and HST. This is like our provincial taxes, because when you look at your provincial taxes, which can be significant, it can be in Alberta, we're at 5% for our GST, and a number of provinces are higher than that. The bottom line is on housing, if it is a new build, that is to say, it is not a resale. If it is a new build, then these taxes apply. If it's in the resale marketplace, then generally speaking, they don't apply. So there's that actual plus to moving into the resale market versus looking at the new home. And lastly, just talk here a little bit about the whole idea of what from a big standpoint are the differences. I only mention FINTRAC because more and more individuals in the Canadian landscape are getting familiar with FINTRAC. That is Financial Transactions and Reporting Analysis Center. Basically, it is our contribution to looking at obligations under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Act. And as a result of that, we basically have to identify every individual that we work with, to the point where in some cases we actually need to go in and look at lists in terms of individuals who can and cannot purchase on the Canadian landscape. Of course, some of that will go away now for at least for a 2-year period anyway. So, but yeah, if you hear the real estate agents in Canada talking about FINTRAC, it's usually because it's a requirement and it's somewhat onerous on the brokers. And within the last 2 months, I had 2 that we were notified for in British Columbia that were basically fined $250,000 for not following the FINTRAC protocols. So, so for us, it's a regulatory scenario. From a financing standpoint, well, there's differences in terms of the way we finance. We don't have some of the pieces that you have in terms of being able to do something from writing off taxes and those kinds of things related to home ownership. So as a result of that, we have more regulations, and you're going to have 5% down, even if you're a Canadian buying in the Canadian landscape. And you should expect, if you have somebody coming up here, they're probably going to be more likely putting down something in the neighborhood of 20% or whatever. We don't basically use title or title insurance, I should say. We don't use title insurance the same way you do. And that is to say that what we use title insurance for is when there is a problem, or there appears to be a potential problem in something like permits. There's a deck that didn't show up before. Generally speaking, our title system, it's one of the bigger differences between the United States and Canada. So we don't use title insurance the same way you do in the US. We basically have a system that basically tracks, and so I can go, for instance, if I'm making an offer on a property, I can go in and pull that title and see whether there's anything against that title. And then from there, we generally require what we call an RPR, which is basically a real property report, what you would probably call a survey. And so that's the document that we key off of. And so long as there haven't been any changes to the property since the last RPR, that RPR would be good. It's not like you have to have a new one each time, but you do have to have no changes made to the property if you were using an older one. So, like I said, title insurance covers a few more things. So hopefully what I've given you is an idea of macro, that is, why we're so expensive right now, what our supply and demand looks like. We have a couple of changes. We've talked about this whole idea of a 2-year ban. We're going to have to wait and see. So maybe I'll come back in 2023 and tell you not what we think is going to go on, but what actually is going on. Because certainly, as we learned from a pandemic, occasionally what we think it's going to look like is not in fact what it looks like. at the end of the day. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. I'm sorry I'm not there to be there and answer any questions, but Sharon will make sure you have my contact information, and please do feel free to reach out if there's anything further that I can do to assist you with that. And I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day.
So that was Brian Finley. As I mentioned, and he mentioned, he's a CIPS instructor. He's very active with the Canadian Real Estate Association and practices out of Edmonton, Alberta. And again, we're sorry he couldn't be here today, but I think he did a great job sort of summarizing what's happening and sharing some of those key differences in transactions and highlighting the importance of working with local realtors, on either side, whether it's inbound, and for our Canadians to work with you if it's an outbound client. So he identified, and our research shows there's international business happening, and I think will continue to happen. As I mentioned, most of our members report their international buyers are resident buyers. And with this 2-year ban, we're waiting to hear more on what exact properties will be impacted by it. We're still waiting for all the fine details. It is supposed to be for residential. So we do know quite a few from the US will buy recreational properties up here, cottage, let's say on a lake. So we're waiting to get all of those fine details and be able to share that with our members and share out on how that business will continue and what will the real impact be of these federal initiatives. So CREA realizes the opportunity for our members to refer business out and to build their referrals for incoming business. And we didn't have an international member category at the Canadian Real Estate Association. So we launched our Global Affiliates program a few years back with the intention of helping out international real estate professionals, realtors in the US to network with our Canadian realtors, regardless of where they are in Canada in their brand, but if they've identified as being interested in building those international business networks and business contacts. So I'm going to share just a quick video about our program, and then I'm going to highlight a few activities and then open it up for questions. So let's go.
As a member of the Canadian Real Estate Association, you are part of a powerful network full of opportunities to grow your real estate career. You have access to unique professional development courses, industry-specific stats and tools, and exclusive events. By opting into CREA's Global Affiliates program, you can leverage even more benefits, become a part of CREA's active global directory, connect with real estate professionals worldwide, and get increased international exposure for referrals. Because in the end, being a successful real estate professional isn't about where you are on the map. It's about the network you have across it. Grow your global network. In real estate, connections.
Sorry about that. So really what we highlight there is that CREAglobal.ca, and I'll pop it into the chat when I'm done presenting. You can become a global affiliate of the Canadian Real Estate Association. And there's a directory that we have online where you are profiled as soon as you sign up. Your contact information is put into there, and then you can log on with your passwords and get on our site to update, include a video about yourself, and start to search that directory for contacts across Canada, as well as with our other global affiliates. We do have affiliates from across the US, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Turkey, Greece. So you can build your networks globally as well. And we're excited to come down to the NAR conference. It's one of the main international conferences we attend annually. I've got the dates there, November 11th to 14th, but as many of you may know, the fun begins on the 9th with various committee meetings and whatnot. But the expo is from the 11th to the 14th, and the Canadian Real Estate Association has a large booth in the global arena. We'll be back there again. We usually have the iconic Canadian flag hanging from the rafters, so you just have to look up to find us and then make your way over. We do have Canadian realtors that are attending NAR at our booth as ambassadors and can share insights on their local market. We also have staff that man that booth. And I've put on the slide here on Saturday, November 12th from 11:30 to 12:15 is the Canadian networking time on the expo floor. That's in the Global Theater, I think they call it. And we're doing our Great Canadian Road Trip Expo Stop. So we'll have our board of directors, members and our realtors that are attending NAR from across Canada, set up by region there to greet you and talk real estate. We'll have a Caesar drink available and some snacks, and just an opportunity to come down and meet our realtors and the Canadian Real Estate Association staff. So we hope to see you, those that are attending there. We also, as part of our global affiliates, we run monthly webinars. This month, at the end of November, we're doing our Great Canadian Road Trip virtual. It's our third stop, and we'll be highlighting Ontario. So we'll have our Ottawa Real Estate Board president and the Barrie and District Association of Realtors president giving updates on what's happening in their markets. This year, our theme was immigration as well. So we'll have an immigration lawyer who practices in Ontario, highlighting, what's happening in immigration, some things you need to be aware of if you are referring and working with clients that are working through that process, and just share with us sort of the face of Canada and what's happening. We also have our fun holiday webinar, which is really just a great networking with some games. That'll be on December 13th. I can't believe we're already speaking about December and holidays, but here we are. And again, as a global affiliate, you get monthly emails about our upcoming events. You also have the opportunity to take part in a webinar. We host what we call market portfolios, where our members and our global affiliates get on and have some airtime to share who they are, information about their market, maybe properties they may have for sale that they're listing that are maybe of interest to an international a buyer. And it's just, again, an opportunity to network and meet professionals from across the country. And since we're out on the west side of the US and Canada, we do have our Banff Western Connection Conference. This is organized by our Western Region Real Estate Boards and Associations. The Canadian Real Estate Association attends that. We host a CIPS course on January 25th. The conference itself runs from the Thursday to Sunday. Again, a wonderful opportunity if you're thinking you're looking to grow your connections with Western realtors. This is the place to do it. It's held in Banff, Alberta, and I've got the website there, Banff Western Connection. If you're interested to learn more, we'll host the CIPS and have a global reception that evening. So even if you have your CIPS, it's a great to come and audit and take the course with the Canadians that are taking that. So you may want to just put those dates on your calendar and check that one to think about. And we have a saying, you heard it in the video, that in the end, being a successful realtor is not about where you are on the map, but the connections you have across it. And here at CREA Global, we look to build those relations and help our members get in touch with real estate professionals around the world to grow their business locally with inbound and, of course, outbound referrals. And so we hope to welcome you as a global affiliate. This last one just has our contact information. And when I stop the presentation, I'll put some of those links in the email. But I hope we shared a little bit about Canada with you today, and welcome some questions. I do apologize that Brian couldn't be here to answer in person. I know April put something in the chat around commercial. So we really stuck to residential on this. I can share a couple of things. We attended the Hudson Gateway Global Summit last month, and I had a realtor out of Toronto, Raymond Chan, with me give some updates on commercial. And I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but very similar to things and trends you're seeing in the US, tertiary. So over COVID, we saw many companies realize that perhaps they didn't need to be right in the heart of the main metro cities, seeing some operations move to those tertiary or slightly outside of the core areas. So we saw square footage rates increasing as that went out. The office sector, we're still continuing to wait with remote work. What's going to happen? I'm in Ottawa. We have a large federal public service here, and our downtown core is still quite empty. There's no federal mandates to go back to the office. They're slowly integrating that. Like, what does the office look like? So at the Canadian Real Estate Association, we are a hybrid. So we do have opportunities to go into our office, which was the picture I showed at the beginning of the slideshow here today, our presentation, and really looking at those office time is a time to collaborate and network and launching projects, but there is the ability to work from home. So we're seeing how is that going to impact office space and rental rates, and what, Office A, those that can make improvements to air quality and things like that I think will continue, and what will happen to those other sectors. There's some talk around, transformation of office space into condos space. And again, architects being involved and how effectively and efficiently do that. ESG, the environment, social, and governance, a lot of talk around that too, and how that'll impact demand on different types of spaces. And so I think a lot of similar, I don't have any exact figures to share. I wouldn't want to misquote something, but I think overall trends worldwide, I've been involved in many webinars and we hear very similar trends happening, and we're seeing that here in Canada. And I think, office, the tech, a lot of tech coming in, and immigration, again, being a big one there that'll help with our commercial stuff. So I know that was a little bit light, but I hope it shed a little bit of insight for you, April. Sorry. And let me just open the chat. I think, okay, I'm not sure if there were any other questions. I hope to see some of you at NAR. If not, maybe you can show of hands who's going to be there. Or
we have time
Yay.
for a general Q&A. If you have questions,
Perfect.
Go ahead and unmute and hit Sharon with them.
Yeah, and I hope to answer. And if not, I'll say, come to our booth. We had last. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
One of the questions I have, Sharon, is we've seen over the last several years, a general resurgence in manufacturing in the United States. Are you seeing that in Canada as well?
That's interesting. I can't speak to that. I'll be honest. I haven't read any reviews lately. A lot of the things I've been reading about is about the industrial space and sort of warehousing. A lot of talk around that. And I really would hate to misquote. I know.
Yeah.
I would think with what we've experienced in the supply chain and whatnot, that we may see some of that come back as well. But I wouldn't want to give any wrong information there. But certainly with what we've seen with time delays and price increases because of supply chain issues, I would be surprised if we didn't see something to that effect. My parents worked in manufacturing, so they were part of the downsizing when all that came out, jobs lost and retraining. So yeah, it would be interesting.
I have a quick question about that 2-year ban. It's residential, and I assume that's mostly just investment buyers.
So so a lot of questions around the federal ban. It was passed in June, and the government, the Canadian Real Estate Association was part of a consultation process, as well as the Canadian Housing and Mortgage had an open consultation where they tried to get feedback from Canadians. It is looking at non-resident Canadians for 2 years on residential properties. So what we're waiting to find out is what is the definition of a residential property. Recreational seems like it will be exempt from that ban, but again, what defines a recreational property? Are they going to be using population overlays? And those fine details have not been released yet. I'm on guard waiting to hear back from our government relations team on more details. But the Canadian Real Estate did put in a couple of recommendations and insights into this ban. But as far as we know, it's aimed at non-resident residential purchases. As well, you saw on the screen the underutilized housing tax. That's another tax that's new that was also approved in June over the budget and bill reading period. And it's a 1% tax based on underutilized housing, again, owned by non-resident and really aimed at the residential. So all of these two national bans, we're still waiting for the finer details on, but we're still told it will roll out January 1, 2023. Yeah. Yeah. And I think provincially we saw BC has had a speculation tax for a while, again, non-resident speculation tax. Ontario, it was the Greater Toronto Horseshoe area when it first came about. And recently they've had 2 announcements in this last year, expanding the area to Ontario in general and expanding the amount. So I think the key thing there is to really make sure if you have a client looking in a particular area in Canada that you do connect with a realtor on the ground in that area and who's connected with a good tax tax advisor and immigration. One item I mentioned to our members is you may have a client that's working through immigration for residency. There are delays in that process. So something that needs to be considered, you may be working with someone who's working for full residency here in Canada, but if there's a delay and they buy a property, there's a certain amount of time that you wouldn't be responsible for those additional taxes if you're in a certain state of your immigration process. And if you're not, you could be. So I've heard of stories where unfortunately new Canadians maybe bought too soon and there was a delay in residency and they had to pay certain taxes. So it's really important that especially working with new residents, that they have a good tax and immigration lawyer and that all that timing is worked together, and a local realtor would have those connections in their dream team, if you will, of professionals they work with.
Sharon, I also had another question. We notice I do mostly commercial now, but I see a lot of trend of people wanting to go out and have that more farm and ranch lifestyle in US. Like people are leaving the big cities. Like that was our dream, right? To go to the big cities when we're a kid and whatever. And then now everybody's kind of like moving slowly out, kind of like what he was talking about, that we're kind of going outside of the major cities or staying around them. But we see a trend here of more people like farming again and having livestock and things like that.
Yeah.
So I just didn't know if that's something that you guys are also seeing.
Brian would have probably been right up on that, be able to see that where he is, especially in Alberta. I have heard on other webinars I've been on with some of our practitioners, and interesting where people from in the Toronto area who moved out over COVID for larger properties, then now are moving back, especially if they have to come back to work. But I think if we look at this whole environment and green movement, that I bet we could find some of those similar trends that you speak to. I have a brother-in-law that has a hobby farm and that he purchased, and he seems to be going out there more, but I would just be speaking anecdotally. But out in Alberta, Brian probably would have had some examples of that. What I know for where I am in Ottawa, it's a very white collar sort of office worker environment, even though it's a federal government. So we're waiting really to see what's going to happen with work from home. And I think many companies are slowly starting to develop what is that strategy to get people back into the office, or will they? So the next year, I think, will really be telling for even where people are living or where they can live and work and criteria.
We're all in that together globally. I think that's like it's kind of been a long time coming, where why are we still going to work and paying, high electric bills when we could just stay home and be efficient? But we'll just kind of see how that plays out next year.
Exactly. Yeah. It's really interesting. Yeah. To hear.
Another question I had was, so another trend that's happening, and I see a lot in Texas, is that the builders are building commercial on the bottom and residential on the top, like kind of old school New York style or downtown styles. So we're seeing that in a lot more pockets here in Texas of smaller communities where the newer generation is like out of school, they want to buy a condo, but they want to have like restaurants around them and be able to walk and use their electric cars and all that fun stuff, So are you also seeing that?
I would say we are. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Especially here in Ottawa, there was a lot of talk with our municipal government on sort of the 15-minute neighborhoods and transit, and exactly that sort of shop where you live. And so we see there's a few new condo complexes going up around the city here that have that commercial component on the back, and looking at amenities that they're offering, that builders are offering within these condos as well. Some of them that used to be maybe reserved for higher end condos will become more common, dog grooming area, or just acceptance of how people are living and working. So we're seeing, I would say we're seeing similar trends here.
Okay, awesome. Great. I think we're, brotherly places. We probably are doing a lot of the same things. So
Yeah, perfect. And one of the slides I meant to have, I must have either went too quickly in our international survey. Texas has been one of, when we look at where we didn't cover where Canadians are buying external. We really focused on an internal for this, but part of our survey, we do ask our Canadian realtors, if you worked with a Canadian looking to buy internationally, where were they looking? US, I think I mentioned US is number one. I mean, no surprise with all those shared border crossings, but within the US, we tend to see, I guess, the Sun Belt states, which again, a surprise, and Texas tends to be in the top 5. Since we've been doing the survey, it's in the top 5. So you see your Florida, Arizona, California, and Texas is always up there, sort of vying. Florida and Arizona tend to flip flop for the first and second, but Texas is there, and I do connect with Christine Wren of the Austin Board of Realtors and her survey, and it shows sort of similar, and I shared some of our results with her, and I think she put it in her survey as well, where they see Canada and the Alberta Texas connection.
well,
Yeah,
also there's a lot of-
DFW, the numbers are more business related rather than
Yeah.
retirement or whatever, or
Yes.
recreation. So
Yeah.
we see a lot of Canadians here in this market buying because they're here for business reasons.
Yeah.
and also Mexico, right? A lot of
Yes.
Canadians will go to Mexico, and Texas,
yes.
we're right here. So you can
Yeah.
kind of hop and a skip across to Mexico.
Yeah.
Here, so.
Yeah, after US, it's Mexico and Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. Up there, Portugal has been making comeback. So I think for those second properties, yeah, it's really, I like that we all have a similar survey in the association. So NAR survey, it's really, I think it's important. We try to pose the questions in the same way to be able to compare results. And, our percentages won't always be exactly the same, but they're very similar. So you can see that trend and see, generally speaking, this is happening. And my members are reporting it, Christine's members and NARs at the higher level. So really, really good information there.
Awesome. Well, we so much appreciate you, Sharon, and all the information and your time. Did anybody else have any other questions? And did you want to share anything else, Sharon?
Good. No, as I said, I'm really looking forward to attending the NAR conference next week. So anyone that's there, please drop by. I will be at the booth at the CIPS ceremony at the International Night Out. So I will be around. Saturday, I'll be at the booth most of the day. So if you are there, come down for our networking hour. Great time to meet practitioners and our members. I think there's close to 600 Canadians attending NAR this year, so pretty
Awesome.
exciting. That's
great.
So we're back. So thanks, and thank you so much for having me. And as I said, if there's ever any questions, I'll give you an easier email, global@crea.ca. Just remember, global@crea.ca. Just drop us a line and we'll put you in touch with whatever you need. So thank you again for having me.
All right, thank you everyone for attending.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much.